Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Today we're going to be talking about sectarianism in the Middle East.
And to help us unpack this really complex and sensitive topic,
We're going to be looking at excerpts from Frederick Wary's book.
beyond Sunni and Shia.
Now, we often hear about this idea of ancient hatreds driving conflict in the region.
Right.
But is it really that simple?
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what I think is so fascinating about Wary's work is that he really challenges that kind of simplistic narrative. He calls it this myth of primordial hatred, this idea that sectarian violence is kind of inevitable because of, these deep-seated religious differences that go back centuries.
So if it's not just about, these ancient grudges, what else is going on?
Well, Wary argues that reducing these conflicts to just, religious disputes ignores this really crucial factor, and that is the modern political landscape.
Yeah.
He introduces this concept of what he calls instrumental optimism, which basically suggests that ruling elites often exploit existing sectarian tensions for their own benefit.
So they kind of use it to their advantage.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit.
Okay.
What does that look like in practice, this
Well,
instrumental optimism?
Sure. So one example that Wary highlights in the book is this case of a, Saudi Arabian doctor who's running for office in Bahrain. And he's campaigning in this mixed Sunni Shia district. And he gets asked, like, point blank, why are there separate Sunni and Shia political parties in the first place? And it just underscores how the very system itself can be designed to kind of reinforce these divisions.
Right. So it's almost as if they're saying, like, sure, participate in democracy, but only within the confines of your pre-assigned religious box.
Exactly. And this isn't limited to just like electoral processes or anything like that. Authoritarian regimes use a whole playbook to kind of entrench sectarianism, controlling resources, excluding certain groups from power, even manipulating the media. As Wary puts it, the activation of sectarian and other latent social divisions offers beleaguered governments a critical pressure relief valve.
Yeah.
So they can actually kind of create a problem or at least exacerbate an existing problem and then position themselves as the only solution.
Oh, that's so interesting. Like a classic power move, if it would a rather cynical one.
Yeah.
But beyond just, this kind of manipulation by those in power, like how do these dynamics play out on the ground?
Well, to really understand that and understand the long-term consequences, I think we have to look at some specific cases.
Okay.
So let's start with Lebanon, which is a country that's often presented as both a potential model and a cautionary tale when it comes to managing sectarianism.
And Lebanon's history is certainly complex.
For sure.
It's got this system of power sharing, right?
Right.
Intended to kind of balance the different religious groups that are there.
Right.
But hasn't that also led to, tension and conflict?
Yeah, it's a very delicate balancing act.
Right.
And the Taif Agreement, which was signed in 1989, to try to end the Lebanese civil war, tried to address this. Essentially, it aimed for a more equitable power-sharing system, but it also perhaps inadvertently ended up institutionalizing sectarian identities even further.
So while trying to create stability, did it risk solidifying the very divisions it was meant to bridge?
That's exactly it. That is the paradox at the heart of Lebanon's system. And I think it highlights a really crucial point. Simply acknowledging sectarian differences isn't enough. You have to address the underlying power imbalances and inequalities that make those differences so easy to exploit in the first place.
Which brings us, I think, to the Syrian war,
Yeah.
which is just this tragic example of how quickly things can unravel, even in a country that had a history of relatively peaceful coexistence between different religious groups.
Absolutely. The Syrian war, I think, really exemplifies the complexities of this issue. Because while Syria, is often portrayed as the secular state, the Assad regime has very strategically used sectarianism to maintain its grip on power.
And one example I thought was so striking from the book was this anecdote about these rumors that were spreading
Yes.
of Alawites poisoning watermelons that were being sold by Sunnis.
Right.
It's just terrifying how easily distrust and fear can be sown, even without a shred of evidence.
It's true. And these rumors often prey on existing anxieties and prejudices,
Yeah.
which is what makes them so incredibly effective as tools for political manipulation.
Right. And it's not just rumors either.
Right.
Where he talks about this hidden quota system within the Syrian administration,
Yeah.
where the presidency was always reserved for an Alawite.
Right.
And then you had other positions that were kind of divvied up amongst the different religious groups.
Yeah, exactly.
On the surface, that might seem like, a way to maintain balance.
Right. It's this idea of proportionality.
Oh.
But as Wary points out, Such unaddressed potential for violence lingered under the surface of supposedly harmonious intercommunal relations.
So you kind of had this facade of unity
Yes.
while all this underlying tension was allowed to just fester,
Absolutely.
ready to erupt.
Precisely. And while Syria might be an extreme case, I think it reveals a broader truth about the region,
Okay.
which is that sectarianism is very often simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right spark to ignite it.
Right, like a tinderbox almost.
Exactly.
Speaking of simmering tensions and, potential sparks, let's talk about Iran.
Okay.
It's often portrayed as this, monolithic force in the region,
Right.
driven solely by this desire to, spread its version of Shia Islam. But Were paints a much more, I think, nuanced picture, doesn't he?
He does. I mean, obviously, religious identity plays a role in Iran's regional policies. But we can't ignore its strategic interests, geopolitical ambitions, even economic considerations. So to view it through a solely sectarian lens, I think misses a huge part of the picture.
It's like any nation state, right?
Exactly.
They're going to act in ways that they see as beneficial to themselves,
Of course.
with religion being one factor among many.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So take Iran's support for Hezbollah, for example.
Right.
Yeah, there's a shared Shia identity there. But the relationship also serves a strategic purpose for Iran,
Absolutely.
right?
It's about projecting power in the region. It's about countering Israeli influence. It's about securing its own borders.
And the same, I think, can be said for Iran's involvement in the Syrian war as well.
Mhm.
It's a mix of religious and strategic motivations, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And Wary, I think, sums it up well when he writes, Iran might not see itself as a sectarian actor, but circumstances and an aggressive regional policy have progressively moved it in that direction.
So even if their goals aren't inherently sectarian,
Mm-hmm.
their actions can end up deepening those divisions nonetheless.
Right.
It's kind of like walking through a house of cards, right?
Sure.
One wrong step and the whole thing comes toppling over.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
And speaking of precarious situations and potential triggers, let's turn to social media.
Okay.
It's often blamed for, fanning the flames of sectarianism. But Wary suggests it's not quite so simple, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, it's like any tool, right?
Right.
It can be used for good or for ill, depending on the user. And so Wary, he acknowledges that potential, the potential for social media to amplify hate speech, misinformation. But he also points out that it can facilitate dialogue and understanding between different groups.
And there was a really interesting study I thought that was mentioned in the book that looked at these online interactions between Sunnis and Shias.
Yes.
Right.
And while it showed that such interactions do occur, it also revealed a rather disheartening trend, which is that countersectarian views, so those that challenge existing prejudices, are often dismissed out of hand as propaganda.
So even in this, supposedly open space of the internet, people kind of retreat to their echo chamber.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And then there's the kind of, darker side of online discourse, where he cites these examples of these just horrific slurs that are used against Alawites and Shia.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that anonymity can bring out the worst in people.
It's true.
And these hateful words have real-world consequences. They further poison the well of, understanding and trust.
So it seems like social media acts as both a bridge and a barrier then. It can bring people together or drive them further apart, depending on how it's used.
It's not about demonizing technology itself, but rather about understanding its potential impact, and I think encouraging responsible use.
Okay, so we've talked about political machinations, we've talked about the role of social media, but what about the institutions that are tasked with maintaining order? What does Wary have to say about the role of security forces in all of this?
Right. That's a really crucial aspect of this whole issue. And Wary argues that security forces can either perpetuate or mitigate sectarian tensions, depending on, how they function. And he uses the example of Bahrain and Saudi Arabia's criminal justice systems to kind of illustrate this point. And what makes their systems particularly relevant?
Well, he traces their development back to the British colonial period, and he highlights the lasting impact of colonial legacies on these institutions. Essentially, he argues that if a system is built on inequality, then the institutions that are meant to uphold that system will inevitably perpetuate those inequalities.
Right, so you end up with this kind of vicious cycle.
Exactly.
Right, of injustice and instability. It's like trying to build a house on a foundation of sand.
Sure.
It doesn't matter how nice the house looks, it's eventually going to crumble.
And this brings us to a really compelling, if somewhat unsettling, section of the book. And that is the complex relationship between Saudi Arabia and the Islamic State,
Right.
which is a pairing that on the surface seems kind of contradictory, right?
Yeah.
You have the established kingdom,
Yeah.
and then you have the self-proclaimed caliphate,
Yeah.
seemingly at odds with one another.
Yeah, it's tempting to see them as these polar opposites.
Yeah.
But Wary highlights a crucial commonality, and that is their shared Wahhabi ideology.
So rather than rejecting Wahhabism outright, they kind of see themselves as trying to purify it in a way, to return it to its supposed roots.
Exactly.
It's almost like a family feud, right?
Right.
Where they share a history and maybe some core beliefs.
Right.
But their methods and their ultimate goals are just wildly different.
That's a really interesting way to look at it.
And it makes their criticisms, I mean, the Islamic State's criticisms of the Saudi regime all the more potent.
Right. Right.
Because they're essentially saying, we're the true believers.
Yeah.
And you've strayed from the path.
Exactly.
And that's a really powerful message, especially for those who are already disillusioned with the Saudi government.
Absolutely. And it underscores the point that sectarianism isn't just about conflict between different groups, but it can also exist within those groups
Right.
as they vie for power and legitimacy.
So even within a seemingly unified ideology like Wahhabism,
Yeah.
you have these internal struggles, you have these competing interpretations. It's like those Russian nesting dolls.
Right.
You open one up,
Right.
only to find another one inside, and another one, and another one.
It speaks to the, constantly evolving nature of these ideologies and the complex interplay of factors that contribute to these tensions.
I think that's a really good point. And we've covered a lot of ground here, from the strategic calculations of nation states to the murky world of online discourse to these surprising connections between seemingly opposed groups. And I think it's become very clear that, understanding sectarianism requires looking beyond these kind of simplistic narratives.
Absolutely. Wary's work, I think, really reminds us that reducing these conflicts to, quote unquote, ancient hatreds ignores the very real and complex ways in which religion, politics, history, and social dynamics intersect to create and exacerbate these divisions.
So where do we go from here?
If sectarianism is this kind of tangled web of political maneuvering and social divisions and historical baggage, are there any viable solutions?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
And, Wary doesn't offer any easy answers. But he does, I think, suggest a really crucial shift in perspective.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, he argues that, we need to move beyond simply trying to reconcile religious doctrines or kind of paper over these differences.
Okay.
And instead, he says we need to focus on addressing issues like governance, inequality, social trust. These are the things that are essential to building a more peaceful future.
So tackling the root causes, the underlying conditions that allow sectarianism to thrive.
Right. It's not just about changing hearts and minds. It's about changing systems and structures.
Right.
So, creating more inclusive political systems, ensuring equitable access to resources, fostering this kind of sense of shared citizenship that transcends religious identity. These are all crucial steps, I think, towards addressing this really complex issue.
It's a tall order for sure.
It is.
But what you're saying is it's not about finding some sort of magical solution to, an ancient hatred. It's about recognizing that these conflicts are products of the modern world, shaped by the same political, social, economic forces that affect all of us.
Precisely. And that recognition, I think, is a really important first step.
Yeah.
Because if we can understand that complex web of causes, then we can start to untangle it and create a different kind of future.
That's a hopeful thought.
It is.
And a powerful one.
And that's really the key takeaway, I think, from Wary's work. It's not about offering some simplistic solution to a very complex problem. It's about equipping us, the readers, with a deeper understanding so that we can engage in these really critical conversations in a more informed and nuanced way.
Well said. And for you, the listener, we hope this deep dive has provided some new insights into this often misunderstood issue, that you've come away with a new appreciation for the complex interplay of factors that contribute to sectarianism, and perhaps even a sense of cautious optimism that by addressing these root causes, a more peaceful future might yet be possible.
I think so.
That's it for today's deep dive. As always, thank you for joining us, and we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deeper into the issues that matter.